Hello and welcome to Consumer Choice Radio. We're back with another exciting interview here in the last couple of days of the election. I know that we've talked a little bit about this, let's say in the past few months that we've been on the radio, but we wanted to think about ways that we could discuss the environment in a very critical and also effective manner, using all the political sort of jargon of the day, but somehow finding effective leaders who are doing that. And that's why we wanted to bring on Danielle Butcher, who's with us. She's from the American Conservation Coalition. Danielle, thanks so much for coming on Consumer Choice Radio.
Hello, thanks so much for having me.
So there's a lot of things that we normally discuss on this radio when it sort of comes to consumers and how they're affected by certain governmental policies or propositions or things that people are putting together. The environment is one in which we're seen to be very reactive. It's just sort of there's something that comes forward from Senate Democrats or House Democrats or something from some NGO, and we don't really have a sort of positive pro-consumer, pro-innovation message. And it seems as if that's exactly what your group is doing. So could you tell us a little bit about that and everything that the ACC is up to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that for a long time, the environment is an issue that's had this sort of stigma for being more of a left-wing issue, and it's been certainly dominated by those types of values of, central control and having big government kind of regulate and make sure because it knows what's best for the environment and for the land. And there's really been no right of center message on how we could steward the environment, which is a shame because the environment is an issue that I think everyone on both sides of the aisle can care about. And it's an issue that conservative values also apply to very well as libertarian values. And so what ACC is doing is we were a group of college kids who were in the right of center movement. We cared about the environment, and we didn't feel like we were represented by any organization because this is a huge issue to young people, and there was no group tackling it. So we formed our own group, and now we're out there providing, right of center solutions and showing how values like property rights or innovation, competition can actually help the environment more than the status quo and than what we've been seeing over the last couple decades.
And so what has been the response? I mean, obviously what you guys do is unique. What has been the response when you're either talking to, let's say, traditionally conservative folks, or you're talking to people who are maybe left-wing environmentalists? How's the group perceived? I'm sure you have a lot of people scratching their heads based on the overall narrative of the environment.
I think certainly people are surprised to hear that we exist, but I think they're also really excited because this is a gap in the market, if you will, because this is something that, like I said, all Americans care about the environment. It doesn't matter who you are, left of center, right of center, what religion you are, what background you come from. Everybody goes outside and enjoys the environment and wants clean air, wants clean water. And so I think a lot of people are glad to see that there's more representation on the right. And I think the left of center is glad to see the right getting more involved.
So we're speaking with Danielle Butcher here on Big Talker FM, Consumer Choice Radio from the American Conservation Coalition. Danielle, one thing that obviously is on our minds, we're just a few days away from the election. There are many debates that happened. There's a lot of back and forth between candidates, between a lot of congressional candidates. When it comes to promises on the campaign trail or for the elections, were you satisfied with how the environment or environmental issues were discussed, or do you find that there was a little bit lacking?
I think there's definitely more to be desired from the conversations we've had on the presidential debate stage. It was interesting to me that climate change has been kind of the central tenet of environmental discussions for a very long time. It's definitely the biggest environmental concern that people are talking about right now. And you have Joe Biden, who's very much embraced clean, renewable energy sources. And you have President Trump, who has very much been in line with traditional energy sources, who for the very first time actually acknowledged that humans may have some sort of impact on the climate during the debate. What's interesting to me is that neither candidate has really championed nuclear energy, which is the largest source of zero emissions energy that we have. So that is something I would really love to see both of the candidates dive into.
And what has been, on nuclear energy in particular, what are you seeing in terms of the arguments against it Yael and I have talked about nuclear energy previously on the show. I think that it's a fantastic energy source if we care about consistency in the environment. But I also know that there are a lot of naysayers out there. What are some of your responses to the people who are anti-nuclear energy?
Yeah, I think when it comes to nuclear energy, it's simply an issue where we need to separate emotion from reason. I think there's this innate fear of nuclear energy that has kind of been perpetuated by like the Hollywood stereotype of a nuclear meltdown and the worst case scenario apocalypse type situation. And the reality is that's just not the way that nuclear works. We've only had 3 major nuclear incidences in 17,000 cumulative years of nuclear use. We're using nuclear energy across 33 countries in the world. We've had 3 major incidences. Contrary to popular belief, it has not actually injured or harmed or even like killed as many people as some would have you believe. In fact, nuclear is the safest by the numbers source of energy that we have. More people die installing rooftop solar each year than have died from nuclear power.
Oh wow, yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more. Hopefully, that comes into the public debate about this because we are in a new century. The idea that everything is going to be just oil and gas and solar and wind. I mean, we got to be a bit more creative there. So we're speaking with Danielle Butcher. She's the executive vice president at the American Conservation Coalition. And Danielle, one thing that you guys are—I don't know if you're actually still on it or you embarked at this kind of electric. Election tour across the country. I saw some of this. What is that about that you guys have been doing?
Yeah, so this is a project I'm really, really excited about. We have about a week left of it. In, I want to say August, late August, our founder and president got into a Tesla X, and we decided to drive around the country in a Tesla and make stops along the way, meeting with local leaders and innovators and entrepreneurs, basically highlighting the climate solutions that they are spearheading and championing without government intervention. So it's been a really inspiring road trip. We've gone all over the West, Midwest. We've been on the East Coast, down into the South, and now we're finishing up in the Southwest. So we've got about a week left. It's been super inspiring to just see these really niche solutions that you would never think of. So for example, during my portion of the trip, I joined Benji in the Midwest, and we went to a dairy farm where there was an anaerobic digester, which basically means they take the waste from dairy cows. So they take that and they compost it so that the compost can be used for crops and for gardening and just your everyday type compost needs. But then they also take the carbon from that and they turn it into liquid natural gas, which they can then use to power communities all over the country. I mean, the end product, they said, went to California, which is just incredible to me that we have the ability to do that. And no one even knows about that sort of thing.
And one, just to jump in, one thing about the energy stuff, are you also hearing from international partners and groups? Because I know that much of this is very centered on the U.S., but really there's a lot of innovative solutions that are happening elsewhere. I know that when I was in Sweden, I got to drive a compressed natural gas car, and it was the coolest thing I had ever seen. It was a dual tank, so it had gasoline, but it also had the compressed natural gas, and that you can kind of switch between the two. And that's something that apparently in Sweden is pretty common, and the same in Italy. What are some other sort of international solutions that might actually be better than what is currently in our policy debate here in the United States?
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting is that it doesn't have to be based on policy, right? And that's kind of the point. So with the international aspect, what you can be looking at is what innovators in each country are doing, and they can then export that innovation to other countries. And so we've got that kind of free trade competition of ideas going on, which is what, you know, motivates us to do better on this fight against climate change. One example I'll use is I know in Australia, there's this invention called the sea bin, which is basically a bucket that floats in the ocean and it collects the trash. And then when it's full, you go out and you dump the bucket. And that is not, you know, a product of government intervention. That is, this guy was a surfer and he was sick of seeing trash on the beach. It's those types of inventions that I think are ultimately going to make the difference, because the market is much more efficient than government ever could be, and it responds to things much faster. Government is very bureaucratic, it's very slow, things get caught up in gridlock. We can't wait for the government to act on climate change or environmental issues. We need to just be doing it ourselves.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point in terms of waiting for the government to solve a particular problem. Um, that, I mean, that kind of clamps us down in almost every policy area, but it's especially true for climate change. On that note of kind of alternative ways of extracting resources, one issue that I'd love to hear your take on is fracking, because obviously that was a big one in the presidential debate. Is Joe Biden going to ban fracking? Should he ban fracking? All sorts of questions about the efficacy of fracking. Are you able to highlight that debate for our listeners and maybe provide some of your insight on that one as well?
I would be happy to. So Joe Biden has been very, very careful to toe the line on fracking. His running mate Kamala Harris has openly stated many times that if she were in charge, she would ban fracking. Joe seems to kind of go back and forth on it, and he's trying to clear the record, which is creating more confusion because at one point he said this and then he said that. I think he's trying to avoid taking a hard stance because he's trying to win in swing states like Pennsylvania. Now, from an electoral perspective, I suppose that makes sense. From a climate perspective, my organization uses an all of the above energy approach. And what that means is we're supportive of all energy forms where it makes sense, right? So solar energy isn't going to make sense everywhere. Wind energy isn't going to make sense everywhere. And for us, the biggest part of fighting climate change is reducing emissions. If you care about fighting climate change, reducing emissions should be your number one priority. The fact of the matter is, natural gas is how we have reduced our emissions so dramatically. In fact, we have reduced our emissions more than the next 10 countries combined over the next 12 years. So, I mean, we really have a lot to thank natural gas for, and we need to continue using it to continue reducing emissions because, you may not like it. That may not be the answer that sounds nice and pretty, but it's the truth. So, I would say that fracking needs to continue being a part of our energy portfolio.
So Danielle, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has the Green New Deal, and you guys at the American Conservation Coalition have the American Climate Contract. So if I was myself, let's say a supporter of your organization, or I was someone who is environmentally conscious, or I was a legislator who might be in Washington State or North Carolina or Virginia, and I want to focus on the environment from a conservative perspective, why would I sign the American Climate Contract rather than, I guess, just following with the Democratic colleagues and go with the Green New Deal?
Mm-hmm. The American Climate Contract is not necessarily a piece of policy, rather, it's a framework through which we can address climate change. So it's not saying the government must mandate X, Y, or Z. It's saying here are 4 pillars that we could use to tackle climate change. So that includes 21st century infrastructure, that includes natural solutions, energy innovation, and of course, global leadership. So we believe that through those 4 pillars, we can find a lot of the solutions to climate change. What the Green New Deal does is, first of all, it's a non-binding resolution. So it doesn't actually do anything. It's basically just like a marketing tool. But in theory, what it would do is say, okay, these are the very specific policies and goals and regulations that we are going to set. If we get there, we get there. If we don't, whatever. Because what we've seen with the Green New Deal is it has these really ambitious goals, but there's not actually a path to get to those goals under the Green New Deal, right? So it says, okay, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030, but we're only going to use wind and solar. But how? Because the math doesn't add up there. And so what I would say is the Green New Deal for progressives works really well as a marketing tool, as a message, as a statement. It does not work as a policy. And I would even argue that because it is so outrageous and ambitious, it actually delays action because we spend more time arguing over the Green New Deal than we do pursuing actual climate solutions.
And so on that note of the Green New Deal, just to kind of dip back into the presidential election a little bit, because it wouldn't be talk radio without talking about that. Um, how different is Vice President Biden's green plan from the Green New Deal? Because I know a lot of the back and forth was, well, it's essentially the same thing. And Biden would say, well, no, it isn't. And there was all sorts of, I guess, engagement on that and disagreement on that. is the assessment that they are more or less the same thing accurate, or does Biden actually present some solutions that are maybe a little more realistic than what the Green New Dealers have proposed?
I would say it's the Green New Deal light. I think that, like fracking, this is an issue area where Biden needs to toe a very careful line, because he needs to bring along that centrist kind of moderate Democrat coalition that he personally has, but he also needs to like win over the progressives who are all in for Bernie or who are all in on the Green New Deal. And so, you know, he kind of has to do that lip service and say, okay, I'll concede on this point, but we're sticking with this. I'll concede on this. And so it's certainly not quite as bad as the Green New Deal, but I wouldn't go so far to say it is good policy.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to have too much debate on that point. We've been
No.
speaking with Danielle Butcher here of the American Conservation Coalition here on Consumer Choice Radio on the Big Talker 106.7 FM. Danielle, where could our listeners or viewers, how can they follow your work? And what are you working on next that we can plug here on the radio?
Absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter at Danny S. Butcher. You can follow my organization at ACC_national. And you know what? We're just plugging through this election, and we're excited to get started on climate action, no matter whose administration it is. So that's our goal.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Danielle.
Thank you.